I've passed on a ton of companies where I've met the founder and I've just felt like they're not obsessed with what they're solving. And I think that hunger that is brought in from an obsession about a problem or experiencing the problem for years on end, that kind of just creates a level of determination that I don't think you can replicate without that obsession.
Hi everyone, it's Alex York, an associate editor at Forbes, and I am here with Zehra Naqvi today to talk about all you are building as a 30 Under 30 alum and now founder of Lore. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm super excited to have you here. You've had like a crazy career journey, I feel like. Over the past couple of years, you've gone from, one industry to another, and now you're entering into like the founder space. So I'm really excited to talk about the company that you are launching. But before we get into those things, I'd love to know just a little bit about you for our viewers to learn about you as like a human first. So let me in on like where you grew up, where you're from, and kind of, who you are today.
Yeah. So I was born in Singapore, but I grew up in Hong Kong, and that's pretty much where I identify as home. I'm ethnically Pakistani, and so it's like, I always like to say it's like a huge melting pot of Asia and all of those cultures that I grew up with. I think fundamentally when I think about growing up, a huge part of it was obviously my identity and growing up abroad, and in that kind of vein having this like desire to learn more about American culture. And it's funny to talk about it now, but like 15 years ago when I was 10, 11, the only way you could like learn about American culture was via like J14 magazine, Teen Vogue 17, and there was almost a delay that kind of existed within Asia. And so when Tumblr came out and Pinterest and obviously social media, that to me was like a huge unlock, because I found communities of fans, particularly like One Direction and that whole like era of just existing on the internet with so many other people. And so Hong Kong was a huge part of just like who I was growing up. And I actually founded my first company in Hong Kong, and that was also born out of this like frustration that people in my school, in my middle school, would literally like go to, let's say, Bath and Body Works, buy like a hand sanitizer, and because it was so desired via like the YouTube videos we had seen, people would come back and literally charge 20x the price to just get like one Bath and Body Works. Yeah, at school. And so it was kind of this like black market happening in this like school in Hong Kong, but there was such a desire for American products, and that also kind of manifested in like clothing and trends. And again, we went from like a 3 to 4 month delay to like immediately we could see everything trendy in America. And so I started my first company, Glow, which was an e-commerce fashion company. That was like my first foray into entrepreneurship. Literally just like a teenager wanting to make things that my friends wanted. And I think, again, like being in Hong Kong where we didn't have like Forever 21 yet, Topshop, there was no Abercrombie, no Justice, that kind of was a solution. And so I thought we would stay a local Hong Kong brand, but because of Instagram and us kind of being early to marketing on Instagram, we could send products to influencers with like hundreds of thousands of followers and not pay them, and they would just post themselves in the shirt. And it was kind of this crazy snowball experience over a course of a couple months. So we scaled that enormously, scaled it to profitability, and that was really like my first experience in entrepreneurship, and a really huge part of that was just growing up in Hong Kong.
Definitely. Yeah, you are an entrepreneur from the get-go, and you founded that company with your sister, correct?
Yeah, with my sister, yeah.
And what was that experience like, being so young and, like you said, trying to tap into like multiple different ecosystems of like business and trends and all those sorts of things? What was that like for you?
In a weird way, I think when you're younger, there's a level of fearlessness that you just cannot always capture as you get older.
Yeah.
And I think that also comes down to like the notion of being perceived. So when I was doing this with my sister, we were literally kids, and we built the website on Shopify. And back then it was like, oh my God, how are these kids doing this? It's crazy. But now Shopify is like everywhere, and it's kind of become democratized. And I always say it's like, I think just us on the internet, like before this we were talking about iMovie. My parents had no idea how we were stitching these like music videos together and editing them so seamlessly. And I think it was just like the freedom of being a child at the time that really just makes you fearless in a way that I'm still trying to capture now. I think thinking about myself as like a 12, 13-year-old pursuing this, I'm like, who is she? She's like amazing. And I know it's still me, but it's kind of crazy because I do think you have just so much more like, I guess, fearlessness is the way I would describe it when you're pursuing and going down that direction. And I think it's also a lot of trust in the authority of what you're doing, because now, like, if I'm trying to create something for teenagers, I'm very aware of the fact that I'm not a teenager. And so I think it's also like the idea of truly just solving a problem that I was experiencing, my friends were experiencing, and running with that. That was like a huge part of it.
Definitely. And to like recognize that at such a young age, like that is literally the key to business, to like fill a void in the market. So you were, you know, through these experiences growing up, you're very like pop culture obsessed, consumer obsessed, all these sorts of things. When did you then move to the US, and how did that change your perception of these different things?
Yeah, so I went to Columbia for undergrad, so that was 2017. Decided pretty much like I had learned entrepreneurship from the perspective of like e-commerce, and I want to say there's a whole conversation we could have about what being an entrepreneur versus a founder means and the connotations. I very much saw myself as an entrepreneur, but kind of funnily enough, I saw New York as like the place to be for startups and tech. I was like, Silicon Valley, like who cares? Like New York is where you need to be. And so when I came to Columbia, obviously like wanted to do well in school, but I like hounded as many New York-based founders as I could, particularly the VC-backed ones, to just learn whatever I could. If it meant like me just changing colors on a website to A/B test like pop-ups and see how that led to like average order value changing, I would do that for 3 months. If it meant like me just following the founder around to photo shoots with like CPG products, I would do that. And so when I came here, I think I recognized I had one experience, but I wanted to broaden my horizons. So I worked at like a pre-seed fintech company, a Sephora, a beauty brand that ended up being my first angel investment, a cat food company that had raised a Series A, a consumer tech platform for like managing your wardrobe, like anything and everything in between. And I think like those experiences basically made me realize the commonalities amongst all of these companies were just frustration with VC and being like afraid of VC fundraising to a degree, and not even afraid, but just like daunted because it was such an opaque process. And so that realization is kind of what propelled me towards understanding, okay, I've gotten all this tactical experience. By the time I graduated, it was like 14 different startups, from as little as a 2-month-long project to as long as 2.5 years. I pretty much realized founders that had raised no money and founders that had raised 200 million had the same problems, and it all went back to VC. So at a certain point I was like, okay, I spent the last like 8-9 years building my own company and then working for these founders, learning, operating. None of these companies could continue to exist if they did not fundraise, and I had no idea how VC worked. So that kind of like realization was a next step for me, and okay, this is a whole other area of my, I guess, like skill set that I need to address and understand.
Definitely, and I want to get into your VC experience in a second, but first I want to ask, you said that there's a difference in your mind between an entrepreneur and a founder, and I think that that's something that like a lot of people who are building brands or who are like employees at a company kind of gripe with, you know, like, can I be entrepreneurial in this sense, or am I, you know, whatever it is, whatever the experience is, what would you say is the difference in your mind between those two?
So I think it's kind of like a false difference. Like, I don't know if I necessarily believe it, but I think it's this weird dichotomy between VC-backed founder and VC scale and then everything else.
Yeah.
This is what I kind of hate about it, because I think anyone who is brave enough, again, and fearless enough to create a company from scratch and take that leap, there should be no like hierarchy in the way that we describe things. But I do unfortunately think there is this almost like unwritten rule that a founder is one that is VC scale, VC backed. It's almost like truly ingrained in like the tech scene and the VC scene. And I think the entrepreneur captures everyone else. In a way, I think the type of financing that you get literally means nothing. Building a business and having it be profitable, that is what everyone should admire. I don't think chasing VC or just pursuing VC as like a metric for success is really one that makes all that much sense. And again, like, love that ecosystem and I've learned a lot from it. But I think the founder, like when I think of myself, I scaled a company to profitability, and yet even when I talk about it, it's like that was e-commerce, like not VC scale. What I'm doing now is VC scale and the opportunity is huge. What I'm building right now compared to back then, like that was profitable and I'm just getting started right now. So it's more just kind of like, and I think an unwritten conversation or rule that I want to challenge, because I think like a beauty brand that goes on to exit for a couple $100 million, like I have heard VCs kind of talk about that in a disparaging way, being like, that's not good enough or that's not enough. And I kind of hate that notion, because I think there needs to be more nuance behind the way that we talk about like being an entrepreneur, being a founder. There should be no hierarchy, and VC-backed founders certainly shouldn't be put on a pedestal that's above like what I did building an e-commerce business.
And I think there's been a big shift in that the last couple of years, because obviously like, you know, COVID, just after COVID, there was like a huge boom in VC investments and valuations skyrocketing. And like for the past like, you know, couple of years, it just has been like a huge, like you said, like an indicator of success. And I think that recently, and maybe this like ebbs and flows, there have been other forms of either funding or just making money that more and more founders have come across and like realize this is just as legit as being invested in. And coming from the, you know, other side of it, being in the VC world, have you seen that same difference, or how are like people in the business ecosphere right now looking at venture capital funding in like those ways that you're talking about?
Totally. And I think this is also such a good question because it goes back to my first experience before being a VC full-time, which was at a startup called Republic, currently Series B. And their whole mission was democratizing access to private investing, which I think is the focus for the main consumer. But really in the background, it was also changing exactly your point, how startups got financed and what that meant. And so it's funny because I think there's this whole argument right now that consumer is dead. I think everyone's excited about it again, but for the last couple of years, people hated on consumer. They were like, whether it was tech, CPG, anything, they were like, it's not a good business model to invest in, regardless of what it is. Like, consumers were kind of finicky. And I think it goes back to the fact that a lot of companies were just overvalued, to your point, and were taking VC money at valuations that just they were not going to be able to grow into. And I think people are recognizing that, especially in like the 2016, 15 era. A lot of that happened, and then they kind of dipped down around the 2020s. And so now I think there is a lot more willingness to explore like angel investors as a route for financing because the valuations don't get so aggressive. Syndicates are a whole other example of, you could go to a syndicate lead and they have like 1,000 individual angel investors that'll come together and invest in you. I think crowdfunding and equity crowdfunding, particularly what Republic does, also a really good example of that. So I think in a weird way, I feel like everyone's kind of reprioritized and focused on the fact that equity is the most important thing at the end of the day. And I feel like with these sky high valuations, people kind of gave themselves the assumption of, oh, this valuation means I'm going to give away less of a percentage of my company, therefore my equity is more valuable. But then I think people forgot you have to grow into the like valuations. And I think it's a really, really delicate dance between like being pragmatic enough to not have a sky high valuation, but then also recognizing you're going to have to give up some of the company. So I feel like we're kind of coming to like homeostasis, and people are recognizing, okay, like we need to pay a little bit more attention to not just like prioritizing our ownership. We also do have to a degree, think about dilution when it is practical and at a valuation that makes sense.
In your role at Republic, when you were working with a lot of the founders themselves, what was that experience like to kind of walk people through this decision process? And like, were there similar either questions or like challenges that you helped them through? Or what was like your primary role in helping them achieve like the things that they came to Republic to achieve?
Yeah, I think a huge part of it was like the community side of it more than anything. And I find now that there are a lot of founders, particularly in pre-seed and seed, that will prioritize, let's say like an angel investor route or a Republic and equity crowdfunding more than just taking like a single check from a VC. And I think at the end of the day now, it just goes to community is like the most important thing out there. Those are your customers, people who advocate for you. It's almost like having mini salespeople just everywhere. And I feel like back then, we were still, when I first started at Republic, it was 2020, and so we were still in the era of people like wanting to chase those valuations, wanting VC money. And after we would have a conversation with them, they would kind of realize the power of having like 500 to 1,000 people that were raving about your product, who wanted to see you succeed, versus a VC that has a whole other portfolio that they have to worry about. And so I think we leaned very heavily into that. And now it's kind of proven out because the Beehive founder, Tyler Denk, like I think in his Series B announcement, announced that they were doing an equity crowdfund as part of it. And that's like incredibly rare. A company that's been backed by insane like tier one VCs to also prioritize an equity crowdfund in the Series B, like that's kind of game changing. And I think that is proof more than anything. All the questions we were answering 5 years ago have kind of just shown to be true, because founders are now prioritizing the community, the angel investors, and the smaller investors that make a really big difference.
What's your advice for founders today, or just like people building, operators, people in the business space in general, in order to like create that community? Are there things that you advise people do, or ways that they should go about it that's not, because I feel like a lot of people, especially our age, feel like networking is like icky or like not like the vibe that they want to create like true connections in, or those sorts of things. So what's your advice to like young people today that want to start fostering those communities?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think I think about myself. So I did not realize that Twitter was such a huge deal in VC land until I started at Republic and everyone was like, you have to get on Twitter. So I started from scratch. I had like no followers on LinkedIn either. Didn't have like a newsletter. And now 5 years later, I have 14,000 on Twitter, 17,000 on LinkedIn, and my newsletter has 70,000 subscribers. But that, like, again, 5 years ago, it was nothing. And I think the biggest action and kind of step I tell everyone to take, it goes into two things. I think the first category is you do have to just kind of get over like the cringe of it all.
Yeah.
I like to call this like the cringe epidemic, where people are just so afraid to look like they're trying that they just don't try at all. And you just hold yourself back that way. Like it's like the classic saying, it's going to be cringe until it's not, and everyone is asking you how you did it. And so I feel like putting yourself out there, just trying to get over the idea of being perceived. My favorite hack for that is literally just schedule all your posts. I do not tweet or post on LinkedIn Live. I just get it scheduled. It goes out. I don't have to think about it.
Turn the other way.
Yeah. I'm like, I'm not going to worry about this right now. And that honestly helped like a ton. And then the other side of it is, I think, to your point about like networking being icky, I think it's because the connotation with networking is like, here's a transaction. Like,
totally.
I pass you something, you pass me something. I've always been a very like community like minded person, in the sense that like I'm a Pisces, so I'm very like, I just want to give, and that's like my biggest thing. And I truly think that being like a giving, kind person and leading with that, eventually when you need something, you then have kind of like the relationship to help out with it. But again, like even if you give and you don't get anything in return, I think giving is so important. And there's been so much restraint in a way of people wanting to like keep doors closed, not make space for others. And I try to lead with the opposite of that. And I'd say in the last 5 years, that mentality has helped me more than anything else that I've done in this space. It's really just lifting others up with me, giving as much as I can. And now that I'm founding a company, I've like come back like, hey, like I finally have something to ask you for, after like 5 years of having the relationship. So yeah, that's how I think about it.
But it does take time, and I feel like that is something that's so critical to understand, is like you might not, and in fact like probably shouldn't get something out of it right now, but like there are so many things that then that relationship can foster in the future, or support with, or whatever that is. I want to talk about your newsletter a bit. You started that a couple years ago, the Z List, and it has become like such a community place for things in VC, for things in business, like just such a well-rounded kind of like hub of information, support, all those sorts of things. What was the inspiration behind it? Why did you start it in the first place?
Honestly, I started it out of kind of going back to like when I was an undergrad. I, again, had met so many founders, and there were founders that had raised 200 million, founders who had raised nothing. And I think for me, my frustration was like, I still have no idea why VC is such a fragmented industry, in the sense that like the founders, it's almost like they have to like claw to even get like a VC on the phone. And then now that I know VCs, I realize that they're just constantly parsing through everything and constantly searching for a company that they believe in or resonate with. And so when I started the Z List, it really just started as like a tiny Gmail. It wasn't even a newsletter. It was like an email that went out to 20 people. And it was like, okay, here are the 15 VCs that I've met through just like going up to them when they were speaking on campus at Columbia, or just like messaging them on LinkedIn, and just sending them a list of the companies I was seeing in the wild, but then the founders I'd met and the founders I'd worked with. And that slowly started snowballing, because the VCs would of course like request introductions to the founders. And then I remember I got like my first email from a founder that said, this person you introduced me to invested $75,000. And I was like, okay, there's something here in the whole like notion of giving and creating a community. And so the Z List, like very selfishly, the Z is for myself. Everyone's like, oh, it's Gen Z. And I'm like, no, it's for Zehra. And I basically at a certain point realized, okay, I have a couple hundred people on this. I think I need a software to do it. And I'm a Substack hater. I'm sorry. I don't love Substack. And so when Beehive came out, they were also kind of early stage at the time. I was like, this is the perfect platform for me to get this off the ground. And so it really just started with like a couple hundred people. VCs would tell their friends about it. It was like a point of deal flow. And then I started angel investing. So I would have portfolio updates, and it really just kind of snowballed online as like a form of introductions and deal flow. And then founders would want to be on the list so they could get featured. And then on the other side of it, I was just hosting so many events in person. So again, if I was making the introductions over email, I was also hosting like a dinner for 10 people. Like I'm the type of person where if I just like get a reservation for 10 people, I'll just call enough people until I can fill the reservation like last minute. I won't give anyone like a chance to say no, and I'll be like, okay, you're gonna show up and we're gonna build community, talk to each other. So I think the Z List also in person, kind of in tandem with IRL and URL, the IRL side of it was like, let's make these introductions in person. Let's actually create valuable events that people want to go to. The event side of it came out of the frustration of me being on the Upper West Side, going deep into Brooklyn for like an event that was bad and having to go back up on the subway. So I was like, okay, I want to actually give people like what they're looking for, and not just like another, you feel awkward, you don't know how to interact with people, just create some structure.
What do you, or did you, and currently, because you're an angel investor as well, what do you look for in companies that you're going to invest in? You mentioned like VC, capital, VC might have like red and green flags. What are yours, and how does that align with like the industry standards?
This might be a hot take, but while at Republic, my clients were founders, and then at Headline, obviously I was only talking to founders. And so for the last better 5 years of my life, I was talking to anywhere from 15 to 30 founders every week. It was genuinely shocking, the percentage that would actually sound enthusiastic about what they were talking about and obsessed. For me, and this will lead into what I'm building eventually, but I think like, if you're building anything, you should sound obsessed and you should sound excited. And it's bizarre to me that sometimes, like, I know everyone has different styles of communication, but I'm a Pisces. So I feel like I can actually tell the way that someone feels about what they're talking about. And I think that obsession about the problem, about the solution, about what you're doing, to me, that's my ultimate green flag. Even if something looks good on paper, I've passed on a ton of companies where I've met the founder and I've just felt like they're not obsessed with what they're solving. And I think that hunger that is brought in from an obsession about a problem or experiencing the problem for years on end, that kind of just creates a level of determination that I don't think you can replicate without that obsession. So I guess it's kind of nebulous, but I think it is just like really reading people. And I really only angel invest early stage. I'll sometimes do a Series A if I've known the founder for a long time, or a Series B, or I use the product, whatever it is. But for me, from an angel investing perspective, I'm only giving my capital to someone if I see that obsession in their eyes and that determination to actually create something that they're extremely passionate about.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense. How do you feel like your, experience in VC, what were some of like the expectations versus reality of the industry? You and I have talked about this a lot, like just and like as you're mentioning, it can be such an opaque industry, and like not really understanding like how it works, what the conversations are like. How were those conversations when you were like in the room with these people, and how was there anything that you like wanted to change after experiencing it firsthand?
Yeah, I think I always knew that VC was very like, okay, we're gonna reach out to people and we're gonna have a conversation and we're gonna chase folks, but I didn't realize the degree to which it was like, this is a sales job.
Right.
Like at the end of the day. So that's why when I reference Republic, I was in business development at that startup, and then I was a junior investor at Headline. And being in both of those positions, I kind of realized at the end of the day, this is a job where you're talking to people, and I don't think I realized how precise the VC side of it was. I'm again someone who has like a list of companies that I'm obsessed with. It constantly changes, things get removed, things get added. I didn't realize how systematic, like Salesforce CRM-esque, the experience of VC is across all types of investors. And I think this applies even up to when you're a partner. So that was one realization that I truly didn't realize. And I also didn't realize, even if you are meeting with one investor on another side of the team, the whole fund is going to be able to look at your email chains, all the notes from your company, everything in one place. So I always tell founders, if you're meeting one person, don't just assume they're the only person who's going to read everything you're saying. Yeah, you're meeting everyone. And that CRM link is going to get shared around on email, Slack, everything. And so that was, I think, one true realization where I was like, I kind of knew this, but it was also crazy to experience it firsthand. And then I think the other side of it is really just how winning deals and like chasing founders comes down to not just getting them on the phone in the first place, but also just now like founders are in a position where I think there is a lot of capital in VC, and founders want VCs and are looking for investors that are proving to them beyond the capital, what else are you good
Right.
for? And so I think that I'm so thrilled by that, because I don't think that was always the case. I think it was hard enough to get VC funding in the first place. Having a VC now be like, here's all the talent that I can introduce you to, the engineers that I know, the designers, like anything that actually helps the company function. I think that side of it has become incredibly important, at least from what I've seen in the last year. And that's a huge reason why certain funds are able to win incredible deals.
Do you think that now then, like, the founders have the upper hand in these things, even though they're really asking for something?
I think so. I think the founders do actually have the upper hand now. I feel like we're in an era where all the like hot deals, quote unquote, that I heard about would have anywhere from 3 to 8 term sheets that were all competing against them minimum. It was multiple offers from different people who then again, after the capital, it came down to conversations of, let's double the valuation,
Right.
or let me prove everything else that I can actually add to this beyond just the term sheet that I'm offering to you. So I actually think we're in a founder's world, which I love. And I always like to say, if a VC is interested, you're going to know. And
Yeah.
it's kind of one of those things where they will just keep pursuing you. And that's just kind of the reality of the game. It is really a sales job at the end of it.
Definitely. And as you said, we're in a founder's world now. You yourself are now officially like a founder of an enterprise. I want to talk about Lore. As we've been talking about in this conversation, you've always been consumer obsessed. You've always been like community driven, as you were saying. Walk me through what Lore is and why you wanted to build this company.
Yeah, so I like to say Lore is the internet curated for the obsessed. And the way that I really think about that is when it comes to my experience being a fangirl on the internet in the 2010s versus now, it's almost weirdly harder to be a fan. I think information is diluted and fragmented. When I watch a new TV show or I'm obsessed with a new book, I Google, let's say like, okay, The Secret History by Donna Tartt. And then I'll have to go through like a whole Reddit thread, parse through everyone's opinions. Then I go on TikTok, maybe find a couple of videos that resonate. And it's just this whole fragmented experience. And then I will never get information about The Secret History again because there's no platform that will give me that.
Yeah.
On top of the fact that like, when Liam Payne passed away, R.I.P. Liam, One Direction was such a huge part of my life. And I found out like 12 hours later. And I was just frustrated because I was like, why is there nothing where the internet knows me well enough to tell me about this? Similarly, was frustrated like Lord of the Rings. I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. And I just found out that they're doing a whole orchestra performance at Radio City Music Hall with the last movie playing. And I was like, why didn't I hear about this? And so Lore for me was born out of this frustration of, I love following people, I love following my friends, I love social media, and obviously I love content. But I was just really frustrated with the fact that there was no place for me to just follow my fandoms, follow topics that interested me. And so Lore, eventually when we get the product out, is really gonna kind of feel like a place where you're able to fall down that internet rabbit hole the way you might have as a kid. The reality is though that we all have bills to pay, and so we don't have the time to parse through like every Reddit thread the way that we want to. And I think it's kind of like basically Lore is to give people access to the things that bring them joy a lot easier. And I want to create platforms that are driven on joy and focused on the joy that you get from the things that you love. And so if there's a place where I can log on and see Disney updates, but then also Lord of the Rings updates, Donna Tartt's Secret History updates, and then also like the Brooklyn Nets and random niche lore about like New York in the 1970s. Like I want those updates. And so Lore really is a platform to allow you to follow your obsessions. But then I also say it's also for the nosy. So if you just kind of want to get the TLDR on like some beef that's happening in pop culture, you no longer have to Google and try and read these like incomprehensible articles or Reddit threads. Lore will be the place where you're like, what happened with this breakup or whatever, and then you actually get all of that presented to you. So very, very much early stages, but it's for the nosy and for the obsessed.
I love it. Is it going to be an app? Is it like a website? What's the like format that it's going to exist in?
So we're starting with the website.
Okay.
I remember, again, all my fondest memories are like tumblr.com on Google Chrome and having that bookmarked, Pinterest initially, everything. And so we're really going back to like the 2010s era of the internet. And so we're starting with web. We'll eventually have a web app and an iOS app, but I really do want this to feel like you are spending hours not even doom scrolling, but you're really just like doom clicking and in the nicest way possible, where you're falling down that internet rabbit hole and learning all of these things, but then also having a way to maintain it and being told like this month you learned 15% more about One Direction lore, something like that. So we're starting with a website and it's going to be out in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, that's super exciting. You also have already closed your pre-seed round for the company despite not having launched yet. And I'm assuming that a lot of this was from these connections and the community like we've been talking about that you had built up over the past couple of years. What was it like to start having these conversations? Were you reaching out? Were people reaching out to you? How did this happen?
Yeah, I think funnily enough, everyone's told me, even when I became a VC, that they knew I was going to be a founder again. I don't know if that's like some aura I give off or something, but I think it was kind of this like underlying understanding that if I were to pursue something, I would be incredibly serious about it. And so I got to a point with Laura where I was like, am I going to regret not doing this on my deathbed? Can I commit like 5 decades of my life to this? And when I got to those 2 points, I was like, I have to do this. There's no question. And the founder market fit is kind of crazy because I, again, like grew up on the internet. I have that whole fangirl perspective, but then also coming with this like operating VC background. And so when I started having initial conversations, the first investor that actually ended up being my pre-seed investor, they were like so just bought into this idea. And I think it was because the way that I talked about it like fervently and obsessively, because that was a huge part of it. They had to believe in me as well. But then also just the opportunity again with AI right now, I've had this idea for 8 years and I've been telling people about this for years. You can ask anyone. It just never would have existed before AI. And so I think that side of it is also what made it so pertinent. I really only spoke to a couple of investors, the ones that I trusted and loved and got to see how they interacted with founders and really just had that experience of knowing that they were incredible people. And I think that's kind of the direction I ended up going in. We are still fundraising with angel investors. And so I have a whole other conversation there about the angel investor fundraising experience. But yeah, that's kind of how it all worked out, everything.
How do you plan on monetizing it? Do you plan on monetizing it? Because I feel like, especially in consumer social, there's a lot of like opinions about how, without ads, essentially, like you can't monetize it or you have to pay a subscription, whatever it is. So what are your thoughts on that? How do you expect to move forward?
Yeah, we definitely don't want to have ads in lore. This might like in 10 years come back to haunt me. But I think right now I'm very focused on the fact that I really don't want ads on lore. I want this to almost be such an intimate experience that you have on the internet where it feels like your diary. And I'm like, do I want to open my diary and see like an ad for something that's not relevant to me? No. So I don't think we're going to go down that path. I'm still exploring what the business model is going to look like. And again, I'm extremely fortunate that I was able to fundraise and explore up to this point without necessarily having the most like concrete idea of what every possible opportunity of revenue generation for lore is going to look like. I think we have an idea of potentially going down like a B2B avenue and working with the individuals that are creating like the canon stories for fandoms to be based off of, but still exploring. So we're really going to allow the fans and the users to tell us what they want. And I think that's my frustration with a lot of the internet. And I think even just like consumer in general, we need new like inventive business models. And I think with AI, we're going to have a lot more experimentation there.
Definitely. When do you expect it to be like available to users?
So we're going to actually start with an MVP, which is more of like a beta testing situation. That's going to come out around Valentine's Day. And we're going to line it up with like a couple of fun little activations related to just fandom lore around Valentine's Day. So we're going to do an MVP, which is going to be kind of like that first step of being able to traverse let's say like the lore of the internet and the fandom side of it, the subjective search of it all. And then eventually in the next couple months, hopefully in the fall, we're going to have that like full first product for you to actually be able to like maintain your interests, follow them, and then continue going down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I love it. In the next, like, let's say 3 to 5 years, what are some of your expectations for the future of what people are going to be obsessed with?
Yeah, I think, funnily enough, I feel like we're gonna have this weird, reverting back to almost like the core fandoms of, I want to say, the early 2000s. In a weird way, I feel like fandom now has almost become like a diluted term because there's just like so much content out there, which is great and people love it. But I just read an article, and I'll send it to you, about this, where the quality of content is typically assessed by like, is someone going on their phone during the TV show, the book, the movie, whatever it is, or are they not? And so I think we're gonna go back to almost like the core idea of fandom in like the early 2000s, where there was like a specific place or a fan account that you went to find all of the new fan theories about something. And just like, and I would say this even existed in the 2010s, there were like certain fan accounts you went to that aggregated all of that information. I think we're gonna go back to that, and maybe I'm like leaning very heavily into what lore is going to do, but I think that's the direction we're going into. And then I think we're also going to have a very, maybe this is like a far out there prediction, but I think we're going to have this like reversion back to like the ancient Greek, ancient Egypt like obsessions. I'm just starting to see things online, and I feel like history is going to have its moment again. a lot of us who are now like the older Gen Zs are the ones that were obsessed with like Percy Jackson and like that era of like the 2010s. So I kind of see us going back to that like historical obsession. And I think just given where we are in the world right now, there's going to be a lot of like attention on what's happened in history. So those are some of my theories, but I think there's a lot more out there that's going to become popular, but I think we're going to revert back to some of that stuff.
Yeah, no, it's super exciting to think about all the like community that you're going to create and just these different corners of the internet that are, you know, the internet is growing, and if you can find a place that's like niche and serves your needs, that's what people are looking for today. So
exactly.
Thank you so much for joining me. This is so fun to chat.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.